Kokoro, Natsume Soseki, Part 3, Lower, Sensei and His Testament. Chapter 1. This summer I received 2 or 3 letters from you. I remember that the one in which you wrote, asking me to help you because you wish to secure a respectable position in Tokyo, was certainly the second one that came into my hands. When I read it, I thought I should like to do something for you. At the very least, I thought I ought not to leave it unanswered. But to confess the truth, I made no effort at all in response to your request. As you know, for a man like me, it is more fitting to say, not merely that my circle of acquaintances is narrow, but that I live entirely alone in this world. I have no room at all to undertake such efforts. But that is not the real issue. The truth is, I was at that time tormented by the question of what I ought to do with myself. Should I go on existing as I was, like a mummy left behind among living men, or else? In those days, whenever I repeated that phrase, or else, within my heart, I shuddered, like a man who has come at a run to the edge of a precipice, and suddenly peers down into a valley whose bottom cannot be seen. I was a coward. And, like many cowards, I suffered in just that measure. Regrettably, it would scarcely be an exaggeration to say that at that time you hardly existed for me at all. To go a step further, your position, your means of livelihood, such things were utterly meaningless to me. I did not care in the least. I was in no state to concern myself with them. I had merely placed your letter on the writing stand, and as it was, I went on sitting with folded arms, lost in thought. Why should a man who has property enough at home, even before graduating or failing to graduate, struggle and rush about crying, "Position, position"? That was all the glance I gave you, far away as you were, and I gave it with a bitter feeling. I tell you this as an excuse, because I was bound to answer you, and yet did not. I am not using rude words intentionally in order to anger you. I believe that if you read on, you will understand my true meaning well enough. At any rate, I remained silent where I ought to have said something, so I wish to ask your pardon for the sin of this negligence before you. After that, I sent you a telegram. To put it plainly, at that time, I wanted a little to see you. And then, as you wished, I wanted to tell you my past. For your sake, you sent a reply telegram, refusing, saying that you could not come up to Tokyo now. I was disappointed, and for a long time I kept gazing at that telegram. It seemed that a telegram alone did not satisfy you either, for afterward you sent me another long letter. From it, I understood clearly the circumstances that made it impossible for you to come to Tokyo. There was no reason whatever for me to think you a rude man. How could you leave home with your dear father ill? How could you possibly do such a thing, setting aside your father's sickness? It is rather my own attitude, as though I had forgotten the life and death of your father. That was improper. The truth is, when I sent that telegram, I had forgotten your father entirely. And yet, while you were still in Tokyo, it was I who warned you so earnestly that his illness was grave and that you must take the greatest care. I am this sort of contradictory human being, or perhaps more than my brain. It is my past pressing down upon me, that has transformed me into such a contradictory man. Even in this matter, I fully acknowledge my own self. You must forgive me. When I read your letter, the last letter that came from you, I thought I had done a bad thing, so I considered sending you a reply to that effect, and I even started to take up my pen, but I stopped without writing a single line. If I were to write at all, I wanted rather to write this letter to you, and because to write this letter the time was still a little too early, I stopped. That is why I again sent only a brief telegram, saying simply that there was no need for you to come. Chapter 2. After that, I began writing this letter. For a man like me, who is not accustomed in ordinary life to taking up the pen, it was a heavy pain that events and thoughts would not move forward as I wished them to. I was on the verge of abandoning this duty of mine toward you, yet no matter how much I thought I would stop and laid the pen aside, it was useless. Before an hour had passed, I wanted to write again. Seen from your side, this may appear to be a trait in me that places great weight on the fulfillment of duty. I do not deny that either. As you know, I am a solitary man, almost without dealings with the world. And so, if I look about me, to right and left, before and behind, there is no duty worthy of the name that has spread its roots in any direction around me. Whether by intention or by nature, I had been living a life in which I cut such obligations down as much as possible. But I did not become this way because I was indifferent to duty. Rather, because I was too keenly sensitive and lacked the strength to endure stimulation, I came, as you see, to pass my days in this negative fashion. Therefore, once I have made a promise, it is most unpleasant to me not to carry it out, even if only to avoid this disagreeable feeling toward you. I must take up again the pen I laid aside. Besides that, I want to write apart from duty. I want to write my past. My past is my experience alone, so it may safely be called my possession alone. To die without giving it to another might be called a loss. I, too, have something of that feeling. Yet if I were to give it to one who could not receive it, then I would rather bury my experience together with my life. Indeed, if there did not exist here one man called you, then my past would have remained my past alone and would never have become, even indirectly, another person's knowledge. Among the many millions of Japanese, it is to you alone that I wish to tell my past, because you are earnest, because you said that in earnestness you wish to draw living lessons from life itself. I shall cast, without reserve, the shadow of a dark life over your head. But do not be afraid. Fix your gaze steadily upon what is dark, and from within it take what may serve you. When I say mine is dark, I mean, of course, dark in an ethical sense. I am a man born ethically. I am also a man raised ethically. The ethical ideas I hold may differ considerably from those of the young people of today. But however mistaken they may be, they are my own. They are not rented garments borrowed in haste for the occasion. And so I believe they may perhaps offer some guidance to you who are still about to grow. You will remember well how often you directed arguments toward me about the problems of modern thought. And you will remember equally well my attitude toward them. I did not go so far as to despise your opinions, but I could never reach the point of paying them respect. Your ideas had no background, and you were far too young to possess a past of your own. At times, I laughed. You often showed me a face that seemed dissatisfied. At last, you pressed me to unfold my past before you like a picture scroll. At that moment, for the first time, I respected you in my heart because you showed the resolve to see something living from inside me without hesitation, because you tried to split open my heart and drink the warm blood that flowed from it. At that time, I was still alive. I hated to die, so I put it off to another day and rejected your demand. Now, with my own hand, I am trying to tear open my own heart and splash that blood across your face. If, when my heartbeat stops, a new life can come to dwell within your breast, I shall be satisfied. Chapter 3. When I lost my parents, I was still not yet 20. I seem to remember that my wife once spoke to you of it. They died of the same illness. And just as she made you suspect, they died one after the other, so close together that it was almost as if they had died at the same time. The truth is, my father's illness was the dreadful typhoid fever. It was passed on to my mother, who remained beside him and nursed him. I was the only son born between the two of them. There was a fair amount of property in the house, and I was raised rather generously. When I look back upon my past, I think that if my parents had not died then, if at least one of them, my father or my mother, either one, had remained alive, I might have been able to keep that easy, untroubled spirit until this day. After the two of them were gone, I was left behind, stunned and vacant. I had no knowledge, no experience, and no judgment. When my father died, my mother was unable to remain at his side. When my mother died, she had not even yet been told that my father was dead. Whether she had sensed it, or whether, as those around her said, she truly believed that my father was recovering, I do not know. My mother only entrusted everything to my uncle, pointing, as it were, to me who was standing there. She said, "Please, this child, I beg you, in every way." Before that, with my parents' permission, I had already been supposed to leave for Tokyo. So my mother seemed to mean to mention that as well. And when she added only, "to Tokyo," my uncle at once took up the rest and answered, "Very well, you must not worry at all." Perhaps my mother was a woman with a constitution strong enough to endure a fierce fever. My uncle said, "She is a firm one," and praised her to me. But whether this was truly my mother's last testament or not, when I think of it now, I cannot tell. Of course, my mother knew the dreadful name of the illness my father had contracted, and she also knew that it had been passed on to her. Yet whether she believed beyond that this illness would surely take her life, there, I think, there still remains plenty of room for doubt. And besides, the words my mother spoke when her fever was high, however coherent and clear they may have seemed, often left behind not the slightest trace of shadow in her own mind as memory. But that is not the issue. It is only that this habit of mine of loosening things apart, or else turning them round and round to look at them from every side, was already fully present in me, even in those days. I think I must tell you that from the very beginning, and as an example of it, I think that a description like this, which seems to bear little relation to the matter immediately before us, may in fact be of some use, so please read with that understanding. I think that this disposition, extending in an ethical way to the acts and conduct of individuals, made me afterward more and more inclined to doubt the moral sense of others. And since it certainly lends a great positive force to my anguish and my suffering, I ask you to remember it. If the story strays from its proper course, it becomes harder to follow. So let me turn back again. Even so, in writing this long letter, I think that compared with others who might be placed in the same position as mine, I am perhaps a little calmer. Even the sound of the streetcar that begins to be heard when the world has gone to sleep has now ceased. Outside the storm shutters, without my noticing when it began, the pitiful voice of insects is faintly sounding in a tone that quietly calls back again the autumn of dew. My wife, who knows nothing, is sleeping innocently and peacefully in the next room. As I take up the pen, each letter, each stroke, sounds at the tip of it as it is formed. Rather, I am facing this paper in a composed state of mind, because I am unaccustomed. The pen may slip off to one side, but it does not seem that my thoughts are in confusion and that my writing runs wild in disorder. Chapter 4. At any rate, left behind all alone, I had no path open to me except to rely on this uncle, just as my mother had told me to do. And my uncle, for his part, took everything upon himself and looked after all matters for me. He also arranged things so that I could go to Tokyo as I had wished. I came to Tokyo and entered the higher school. The students of the higher school in those days were far more savage and rough than they are now. Among those I knew, there was one who, in the middle of the night, quarreled with a workman and wounded the other man's head with a wooden clog. Since it happened after he had been drinking, in the frenzy of their blows, he ended up having his school cap taken away by the other man. Now, on the inside of that cap, his name was plainly written on a white, diamond-shaped piece of cloth. That made the matter troublesome, and he very nearly came to the point where the police would inquire at the school about him. But his friends went to a great deal of trouble, and in the end managed to settle it without letting it become public. If one were to tell you, who have grown up in the refined atmosphere of the present day, of such violent conduct, it would no doubt strike you as absurd. I, too, in truth, find it absurd. Yet in return, they possessed a certain simple and honest quality that students of today do not have. At that time, the money I received each month from my uncle was far less than the school funds your father now sends you. Of course, prices must also have been different. Even so, I felt not the slightest want. More than that, among the many classmates I had, I was by no means in such a pitiful position, financially speaking, as to envy others. Looking back now, I suppose I was rather one to be envied by them, for besides the fixed remittance I received every month, I was often able to ask my uncle for money for books. I had liked buying books even in those days, and for other incidental expenses as well, and could go on spending it more and more, just as I pleased. Knowing nothing, I not only trusted my uncle, but always, with a heart full of gratitude, respected him as someone to whom I was indebted. My uncle was a man of affairs. He even became a prefectural assemblyman. Perhaps because of that connection, I seem to remember that he also had ties to a political party. He was my father's own younger brother, yet in that respect, in terms of character, he seemed to have developed in a direction quite altogether different from my father. My father was a man of nothing but sincerity, one who carefully preserved the estate handed down to him from his ancestors. For his pleasures, he practiced the tea ceremony and flower arrangement. He also liked to read collections of poetry. He seemed as well to have many tastes in such things as calligraphy, painting, and antiques. Our house stood in the country, but from a town about 2 ri away, the very town where my uncle lived. Dealers in curios would sometimes come all that distance, bringing hanging scrolls, incense burners, and the like, simply to show them to my father. If one were to describe my father in a word, one might perhaps call him a man of means. He was a country gentleman with comparatively refined tastes. So, in temperament, there was a great gulf between him and my open, energetic uncle, and yet the two of them got on together strangely well. My father often praised my uncle, speaking of him as a dependable man, far more capable in action than himself. He would also say that one who, like himself, had inherited property from his parents must inevitably become blunted in his native powers. That is, because he had no need to struggle against the world. My mother heard these words. I heard them too. It seems to me that my father said them rather with the intention of making them a lesson for me. You too must remember this well, my father said then, deliberately looking me in the face. That is why I have not forgotten it even now. How then could I possibly have doubted my uncle, who was trusted so deeply and praised so highly by my father? Even without that, he was an uncle I had every reason to take pride in. And for me, after my father and mother had died, and I had to depend on him for everything, he was no longer merely a source of pride. He had become a person necessary to my very existence. Chapter 5. When I first returned home, making use of the summer vacation, the house where I had lived, left empty by the death of my parents, had been taken over by my uncle and aunt, who were now living there as its new master and mistress. This had already been agreed upon before I left for Tokyo, since I The one lone person left behind was no longer in the house. There was no other course but to do as much. At that time, my uncle seemed to be connected with various companies in the town. From the standpoint of his work, he said with a laugh that it would be far more convenient to continue living in his former residence than to move to my house, which stood 2 rides away. These were the words that slipped from my uncle's mouth when, after my father and mother had died, we were discussing how the estate should be managed and how I should go up to Tokyo. My house had a long history, and because of that, it was known to some extent among the people of the neighborhood. I think it must be the same in your native place, in the country, for a house of lineage and standing to be destroyed or sold while there is still an heir is a grave matter. If it were the me of today, I would think little of such a thing. But in those days, I was still a child. I had decided to go to Tokyo, yet the house had to be left as it was, and I was greatly troubled over what should be done. My uncle, with no other choice, consented to move into my empty house, but he said he would be inconvenienced unless he were allowed to keep his residence in town as it was, and to have the convenience of going back and forth between the two. Of course, I could raise no objection. I was thinking only that any conditions would do, so long as I could go to Tokyo. Childish as I was, even after leaving my native place, I still looked back toward the old home with the eyes of my heart full of longing. Naturally, I looked toward it with the heart of a traveler who knows that his own home still remains there, the home to which he must return. The feeling that when vacation came, I would have to go back was strong in me, no matter how much I had come away yearning for Tokyo. After studying earnestly and playing happily, I often dreamed of that home in my native place, to which I thought I would be able to return in the holidays. While I was away, I do not know how my uncle moved back and forth between the two houses, but when I arrived, all the members of the family were gathered together under one roof. Children who went to school, I suppose, were ordinarily living in the town residence, but they too, because it was vacation, had been brought back to the country, half for play. They were all delighted to see my face, and I too was pleased to see that the house, more lively and cheerful than it had been, even when my father and mother were alive, had taken on such a bustling brightness. My uncle turned out his eldest boy, who had occupied the room that had once been mine, and put me there instead. There were by no means few rooms in the house, so I declined, saying I would be satisfied with some other room. But my uncle would not listen. "It is your house," he said. I spent that whole summer with my uncle's family, with no unpleasantness whatever, except that from time to time I remembered my dead father and mother. And then I returned again to Tokyo. There was only one thing that happened that summer, which cast, rather, a dim shadow upon my heart. It was that my uncle and aunt, speaking with one voice, urged marriage upon me, though I had only just entered the higher school. That must have been repeated 3 or 4 times altogether. At first, I was merely astonished by its suddenness. The second time, I refused clearly. By the third, I was finally obliged to ask them in return what their reason was. Their intention was simple. They wanted me to take a wife early, come back to this house, and succeed my dead father. I had thought that it was enough for the house if I simply came back, whenever school was in recess, to succeed my father, and to take a wife, because a wife was needed for that. Both of these, as reasoning, sound plausible enough, especially to me, who understood the conditions of the countryside. They were easy enough to understand. It may be that I did not absolutely dislike the idea, but to me, who had only just gone out to Tokyo for study and discipline, it appeared far away in the distance, like something seen through a telescope. And, without giving my consent to my uncle's wish, I finally left my house once more. Chapter 6. I let the matter of the marriage proposal slip from my mind just as it was. When I looked at the faces of the young men around me, there was not one among them who seemed settled into household life. They were all free, and every one of them seemed solitary. Among such easy-going people, if one had gone behind the surface, there may perhaps have been some who, compelled by family circumstances, had already taken a wife. But childish as I was, I never noticed such things. And perhaps, on the side of those who are placed in such special conditions, they too, out of regard for those around them, carefully refrained, as much as possible, from speaking of such private matters so remote from student life. When I think of it afterward, I myself already belonged to that number. Yet I did not even understand that, and simply, with a childlike cheerfulness, went on along the path of study. At the end of the school year, I once more tied up my trunk and returned to the country, where my parents' graves were. And there, just as in the year before, inside my own house where my father and mother had once lived, I again saw the unchanged faces of my uncle and aunt and their children. There I breathed once more the scent of my home country. To me, that scent was still, just as ever, something dear and nostalgic. And, as a change to break the monotony of a school year, it could not but have been welcome. Yet, within that very atmosphere, the same atmosphere that had raised me up, my uncle suddenly thrust the question of marriage again right before my face. What he said was only a repetition of the persuasion of the year before. The reasons, too, were the same as before. Only, when he had urged me last time, there had been no actual object in view. Now, however, he had firmly seized upon the principal person herself, and so I was troubled all the more. That person, the one in question, was my uncle's daughter, that is, a girl who was my cousin. If I would take her as my wife, my uncle said, it would be convenient for both sides. He also said that while my father was still alive, he had spoken of such a thing. I, too, thought that it would indeed be convenient if it were done that way, and I thought it entirely possible that my father had spoken to my uncle in such a manner. But this was something I noticed for the first time only after my uncle had spoken of it. It was not something I had understood beforehand, before being told. So I was startled. Startled though I was, I understood all the better for that very reason, that there was nothing unreasonable in my uncle's wish. Am I simply careless? Perhaps I am. Or perhaps that may be so. But most likely, the chief cause was that I had always been indifferent toward this cousin. From childhood, I had constantly gone to visit my uncle's house in town. Not only did I go there often, I frequently stayed the night as well. And from those days, this cousin and I had been close. You too must know that there are no examples of love arising between brother and sister. Perhaps I am extending this publicly accepted fact too freely of my own accord, but I think that between a man and a woman who have always been in contact and have grown too familiar, the fresh sensation necessary for the birth of love is lost. Just as one can smell incense only at the instant it is first kindled, just as one tastes wine at the very moment one begins to drink it, so too I can only think that in the impulse of love there exists, within time, such a perilous single point. Once one has passed through that point without any stirring, then the more accustomed one becomes, the more only familiarity increases, while the nerves of love grow more and more numb. No matter how I reconsidered it, I could not bring myself to think of making this cousin my wife. My uncle said that if I insisted, the marriage might be postponed until my graduation. But since there is also the proverb that says, "What is good should be done quickly," he added that, if possible, he would like at least to have the ceremonial marriage cups exchanged while there was still time. To me, who had no wish in the matter itself, it was all the same, whichever way it was done. And again, I refused. My uncle looked displeased. My cousin cried. It was not because she was sad at not being joined to me. It was because, as a woman, it was painful for her to have a marriage proposal rejected. Just as I did not love my cousin, it was equally well known to me that my cousin did not love me. And once again, I went up to Tokyo. Chapter 7. The third time I returned home was at the beginning of summer. A year after that, I could never wait for the school examinations to end before fleeing Tokyo. That was how dear my native place was to me. You too must remember, the place where one was born has a different color in its air. Its earth has a fragrance all its own, and the memories of one's father and mother float there with a finer closeness. To be wrapped in it for 2 months, July and August, out of the whole year, and to lie still there, like a snake gone into its hole, was for me the warmest and most comforting feeling in the world. Simple as I was, I believed there was no need to trouble my head very much over the matter of marrying my cousin. What I disliked, I would refuse. And once refused, nothing would remain afterward. That was what I believed. So although I had not bent my will to suit my uncle's wishes, I remained rather calm. During that whole year, I had never once remembered feeling burdened by the matter, and I returned home with my usual vigor. But when I arrived, my uncle's attitude had changed. He no longer tried, as before, to gather me into the warmth of his heart with a pleasant face. Even so, spoiled and easygoing as I had been raised, for the first 4 or 5 days after my return, I did not notice it. Then, at some chance moment, I suddenly began to feel that something was strange. And then I found that the strangeness was not only in my uncle. My aunt was strange as well. My cousin was strange as well. Even my uncle's son, who had finished middle school and written to me that he meant to enter the higher commercial school in Tokyo, and with whom I had exchanged letters about the matter, even he was strangely changed. By my nature, I could not help thinking, why had my own feelings suddenly changed like this? No, why had they changed toward me like this? It suddenly occurred to me that perhaps my dead father and mother had washed my dull eyes and made me see the world clearly at last. Somewhere in the depths of my heart, even after my father and mother had left this world, I had still believed that they loved me just as they had while they were alive. Even in those days, it is true, I was not by nature a man blind to reason, and yet lumps of inherited superstition still lay hidden with strong force in my blood. They are perhaps still hidden there, even now. I went alone into the hills and knelt before the graves of my father and mother. Half in mourning and half in gratitude, I knelt there, and with the feeling that my future happiness might still somehow be held in the hands of those lying beneath that cold stone, I prayed to them to guard my fate. You may laugh, and I too think it could not be helped if you laughed, but I was that kind of man. My world changed as quickly as one turns over the palm of the hand. Yet for me, this was not the first such experience. I must have been 16 or 17 when I first discovered that there existed beautiful things in this world. At that time, I was startled all at once. I doubted my own eyes. Again and again, I rubbed them again and again, and in my heart, I cried out, "Ah, beautiful!" At 16 or 17, whether one is male or female, one reaches the age when, as people say, the senses awaken. As my senses awakened, I was at last able to see woman as the representative of all the beautiful things in this world. Toward the opposite sex, whose existence I had never before noticed in the least, the eyes of my blindness were suddenly opened. From that moment on, my heaven and earth became something entirely new. It must have been exactly the same when I became aware of my uncle's changed attitude. I became aware of it all at once. There had been no forewarning, no preparation. It came suddenly. Suddenly, my uncle and his family appeared before my eyes as though they were entirely different beings from what they had been before. I was astonished, and I began to feel that if things were left just as they were, I had no way of knowing what would become of my future. Chapter 8. I came to feel that unless I gained detailed knowledge of the family property, which until then I had left entirely in my uncle's hands, I could not answer to my dead father and mother. My uncle, just as he always described himself as a busy man, did not sleep each night in the same place. He would spend 2 days at the house then 3 in the town, going back and forth between the two, passing each day with an unsettled expression. And he used the word busy at a time when no suspicion had yet arisen. I too actually thought that he must indeed be busy, and besides, I interpreted it with a certain irony, as though perhaps one was not in the current fashion unless one made a display of being busy. But once I had acquired the intention of having a long conversation with him about the property, and looked at this show of busyness through that purpose, I could no longer take it as anything but an excuse for avoiding me. I did not easily get an opportunity to catch hold of him. I heard a rumor that my uncle kept a mistress in town. I heard that rumor from a certain friend who had once been my classmate in middle school. That my uncle might keep a mistress was in itself not in the least beyond belief for such a man. But I was startled, because while my father was still alive, I had never once heard such a report enter my ears. My friend told me various other rumors about my uncle as well. One of them was that, though for a time people had thought him to be on the verge of failure in business, within the last 2 or 3 years he had suddenly recovered and risen again. That too was one of the things that dyed my suspicions more deeply. At last I entered into a confrontation with my uncle. Confrontation may be a somewhat improper word, but as the talk developed, its natural course descended of itself to a place that could hardly be described by anything else. My uncle tried to the very end to treat me as a child, and I, from the first, faced him with eyes of suspicion. There was no possibility that it could be settled calmly. Regrettably, I am now pressing too urgently onward to be able to write here in detail the full course of that dispute. The truth is, what lies ahead of this is something still more important. My pen has long been wanting to arrive there as quickly as possible, and I am only just managing to hold it back. Since I have forever lost the chance to meet you and speak quietly face to face, and since I am not only unaccustomed to the art of taking up the pen, but must also spare precious time, I have no choice but to omit even things I wish to write. You may still remember that once I told you there is no such thing in the world as a villain made from the beginning. I told you that many good men, when the crucial moment comes, suddenly become evil, and that one must not be careless. At that time, you warned me that I was excited, and then you asked in what sort of case a good man changes into an evil one. When I answered only, in a word, money, you looked dissatisfied. I remember your dissatisfied face very well. I confess to you now that at that time I was thinking of this uncle as an example of how an ordinary man, at the sight of money, suddenly becomes wicked, as an example that there may exist in this world nothing worthy of trust. I thought of this uncle with hatred in my heart. My answer may have seemed insufficient to you, who sought to press onward into the depths of the world of ideas. It may have seemed commonplace, and yet, to me, it was a living answer. For in fact, was I not excited? I believe that to speak an ordinary doctrine with a heated tongue is more alive than to utter something new with a cool head. because the body is moved by the force of blood, because words do not merely carry vibrations through the air, but can work more strongly upon something stronger still. Chapter 9. In a word, my uncle defrauded me of my property. It was done easily enough during the 3 years I was away in Tokyo, leaving everything in my uncle's hands and remaining perfectly at ease. I was, in the worldly sense, a complete fool. From a standpoint higher than the worldly one, perhaps I might be called a pure and noble man. When I look back upon the self I was then, and think how I was not born more wicked, I cannot bear the bitterness I feel toward my own excessive honesty. And yet somehow there also rises in me a desire to return once more to that natural self I was born with and try living again in that way. Remember this, the man you know is the man after he has been soiled by dust. If one calls a person senior because he has spent more years being stained and dirtied, then I am certainly your senior. If I had married my uncle's daughter, as my uncle wished, would the result, materially speaking, have been advantageous to me? I think that is hardly even worth asking. My uncle tried, through calculation, to force his daughter upon me. More than kindly arranging for the convenience of both houses, he turned the marriage matter toward me, driven by a baser and more vulgar self-interest. I did not love my cousin, but neither did I dislike her. Yet when I think of it afterward, it gives me some slight satisfaction that I refused. Whether I was to be cheated or not, in the end, it would probably have been the same. But as to the manner in which I was to be made use of, if I did not take my cousin as my wife, then, in at least one point, they were not able to carry things entirely according to their own design. In that sense, my own will was allowed to stand, if only a little, but that is almost too trifling to be worth making an issue of, especially to you, who have no connection with the matter. It must look like an absurd piece of stubborn pride. Other relatives stepped in between my uncle and me. Those relatives, too, I did not trust in the least. Not only did I not trust them, I looked upon them almost as enemies. The moment I realized that my uncle had deceived me, I became convinced that all the others would surely deceive me as well. My reasoning was simple. If even my uncle, whom my father had praised so highly, was like this, then what could be expected of the others? Even so, they gathered together for me everything that belonged to me. When reckoned in money, it amounted to far less than I had expected. As for me, there were only 2 courses open, either to accept it in silence or else to bring a public suit against my uncle. I was furious, and I was also in doubt. I feared, too, that if it became a lawsuit, it would take a long time before it was settled. Since I was still in the midst of my studies, I thought it would be a great suffering to have precious time, so important to a student, taken away from me. After much thought, I asked an old friend from my middle school days, who still lived in the town, to arrange things so that all I had received might be turned into money. My old friend advised me, saying it would be better not to, but I would not listen. It was then that I resolved to part from my native place for good. In my heart, I swore that I would not look again upon my uncle's face. Before leaving home, I went once more to the graves of my father and mother. I have never seen those graves again since then, and surely the chance to see them will never come again. My old friend arranged matters exactly as I asked, though in truth that was only, well, after I had returned to Tokyo. In the country, even if one tries to sell fields and farmland, they do not sell easily. And when the time comes, there is always the danger that people will take advantage of your weakness and force the price down. So the amount of money I received was far below their true market value. To confess the truth, my property came to no more than a small amount of government bonds, which I carried with me in my pocket when I left home, and the money this friend later sent on to me as an inheritance from my parents. It must certainly have been greatly diminished, and since it was not I myself who had actively reduced it, that made the feeling all the worse. And yet, for living as a student, it was more than enough. To tell the truth, I could not even spend half of the interest that came from it. It was this student life of mine, with its margin of ease, that brought me at last into a situation I had never once imagined. Chapter 10. Since I was under no hardship for money, I began to think that perhaps I might leave the noisy boarding house and set up a place of my own. But to do that would mean the trouble of buying household furnishings. There would also be the need for an old woman to look after things, and that old woman would have to be honest, or it would not do. And if I left the house unattended, it would have to be the sort of place that gave no cause for worry. For all these reasons, it seemed uncertain whether such a thing could be carried out on a mere passing impulse. One day, with the idle thought that I might at least go and look for a house, I went out walking, went down the Hongo Plateau toward the west, then climbed straight up the Koishikawa slope in the direction of Denzuen. After the streetcars began to run there, the whole appearance of that area changed completely. But in those days, on the left, there was the earthen wall of the artillery arsenal, and on the right, there stretched an open space, neither quite a field nor quite a hill, covered all over with grass. I stood there in the grass and gazed absent-mindedly at the cliff on the far side. Even now it is not a bad view, but in those days, the whole character of that western side was entirely different. The fact alone that deep green foliage spread out as far as the eye could reach was enough to soothe the nerves. Suddenly, I thought, there might perhaps be a suitable house somewhere nearby. So I crossed the grassy plain at once and made my way northward, along a narrow street. Even now that neighborhood has not quite become a fine district and still feels rough and uneven. So at that time, the rows of houses there were exceedingly shabby. I passed through alleys, turned corners into side streets, and wandered round and round. At last, I tried asking the wife at a penny candy shop whether there might be a small house for rent somewhere in the area. She said, "Well now," and tilted her head for a while, but seemed unable to think of any place at all, saying only, "A house for rent." Well, I gave it up as hopeless, and was just about to leave. Then she said again, "Would a private boarding house do?" At that, my mind changed a little. I began to think that boarding alone in a quiet private house might actually be preferable, since it would spare me the trouble of keeping a place of my own. So I sat down there in the candy shop and had the woman tell me the details. It was a house where the family, or rather the surviving family, of a certain military man was living. The husband, the woman said, had died somehow during the Sino-Japanese War, or at about that time. Until about a year before, they had apparently been living near the officers' academy in Ichigaya, but there had been stables there, and the estate was too large, so they sold it and moved here. Yet now, because the place felt lonely, with so few people in it, they had asked her to let them know if there should be some suitable person who might board there. I made sure, from what the woman told me, that in the house there lived no one but the widow, her one daughter, and a maid. In my heart I thought it would be quiet and exceedingly suitable. And yet, going suddenly into such a household, someone like me, under the label of an unknown student, might at once be refused. That anxiety, too, arose in me. I even thought, perhaps I should not go. But I was not dressed in so shabby a way as to disgrace the name of student. And besides, I was wearing the university cap. You will laugh, no doubt, and say, what of a university cap? And yet, university students in those days, unlike now, were held in considerable esteem by the world. In that situation, I found, in that square cap, something like confidence. So, just as the candy shop woman had told me, I went to visit the house of that military man's survivors without any introduction at all. I met the widow and told her the reason for my visit. She asked me all manner of questions about my background, my school, my field of study, and so on. Then, having no doubt seized upon something somewhere that assured her I was reliable, she at once gave me her answer that there would be no objection at all, and that I might move in whenever I pleased. The widow was a proper woman. She was also a decisive woman. I was impressed, thinking that perhaps all officers' wives were like this. I was impressed, but I was also surprised. With such a temperament, I wondered, where could the loneliness possibly be? Chapter 11. I moved into that house at once. I rented the sitting room where I had first spoken with the widow. It was the best room in the whole house. This was at a time when houses of the sort called superior boarding houses had begun to appear here and there around Hongo. So I already understood well enough what the finest room was like that a student might hope to occupy. And the room that had newly become mine was far more splendid than any of those. At first, just after moving in, it seemed to me almost too much for a student like myself. The room was 8 tatami mats in size. Beside the alcove, there were staggered shelves, and on the side opposite the veranda, there was a built-in closet, 1 ken wide. There was not a single window, but in its place, bright sunlight poured well in from the south-facing veranda. On the day I moved in, I saw flowers arranged in the alcove of that room, and beside them a koto leaning there. I liked neither of them. I had grown up beside a father who delighted in poetry, calligraphy, and sencha, and so from childhood I had possessed something of a Chinese taste. Perhaps because of that, I had acquired, without noticing it, the habit of despising such glossy, showy decorations. Most of the objects my father had collected while he was alive had been made a complete wreck by that uncle of mine, but even so, a few still remained. When I left home, I had entrusted them to an old middle school friend, and from among them I had selected 4 or 5 scrolls that seemed interesting, rolled them bare, and put them in the bottom of my trunk. The moment I moved in, I meant to take them out and hang them in the alcove for my own pleasure. But when I saw the koto and the flower arrangement I have just described, I suddenly lost heart. Later, when I learned for the first time that those flowers had been arranged as a courtesy for me, I smiled bitterly to myself. The koto, of course, had already been there before, so no doubt, having nowhere else to put it, they had simply left it, leaning there as it was. If I tell such a story, the shadow of a young woman will naturally pass through your mind. Even before I moved in, indeed from the very first, before ever I entered the house, that sort of curiosity had already begun to stir in me. Whether it was because such unclean thoughts had already beforehand spoiled the naturalness in me, or because I was still unused to dealing with people when I first met the young lady of the house, I gave a stumbling, awkward greeting. In return, the young lady herself also flushed red. Until then, from the widow's appearance and manner, I had imagined everything about the daughter, but that imagination was not at all favorable to her. Since the wife of a military man was like this, then the daughter of such a wife would be like that. In such a sequence, my conjectures had stretched farther and farther. But the instant I saw the young lady's face, every one of those conjectures was utterly swept away. And into my mind, newly, there came the scent of the opposite sex, something I had never even imagined before. After that, I no longer disliked the flowers arranged before the alcove, nor did the koto, leaning in that same alcove, seem an obstruction any longer. Then, whenever the flowers began to wither, with regular punctuality, they would be replaced, and the koto, too, was often carried away to the crooked room that bent like the shape of a carpenter's square. There, while sitting in my own room, with my cheek resting on my hand, over the desk, I would listen to the sound of that koto. I could not really tell whether her playing was skillful or not, but seeing that she never attempted anything very intricate, I supposed she was probably not especially good. I thought it was perhaps much the same level as her flower arrangement. As for flowers, I could understand them well enough myself, and the young lady was by no means particularly accomplished. Even so, without the least embarrassment, all sorts of flowers kept adorning my alcove. To be sure, the way they were arranged was always the same whenever I looked, and as for the vase, there was never once an example of its changing. Yet When it came to the music, it was stranger still than the flowers. She merely plucked the strings, one note at a time, and never once let me hear the full sound of her own voice. It is not that she never sang, but she gave only the smallest voice, as though she were whispering a secret. And if she was scolded, the voice disappeared altogether. I was delighted to gaze at these clumsy flowers and to incline my ear toward the unappetizing sound of the koto. Chapter 12. At the time I left my native place, my state of mind had already become world-weary. The notion that others could not be relied upon seemed by then to have soaked into my very bones. I began to think of my uncle, my aunt, and the other relatives, whom I regarded with hostility, as though they were the representatives of all mankind. Even when I boarded the train, I found myself quietly watching the manner of the people beside me. If someone happened to speak to me from across the way, I felt all the more inclined to heighten my guard. My heart was gloomy. At times, it grew oppressively heavy, as though I had swallowed lead. And yet, just as I have said, my nerves had at the same time grown sharply pointed. I think this was also a major reason why, after coming to Tokyo, I wanted to leave my boarding house. One may say that it was only because I was under no hardship for money that I felt inclined to set up a place of my own. That is true enough. But if I had remained the person I had once been, then even if I had found some ease in my purse, I would never willingly have chosen such troublesome arrangements. Even after moving to Koishikawa, I was for some time unable to give this strained state of mind any rest. I looked around me so constantly and so nervously that I was ashamed of myself. Strangely enough, only my head and my eyes were active, while my mouth, by contrast, grew less and less willing to move. I sat silently before my desk, watching the people of the house as keenly as a cat. At times, I poured such vigilant attention upon them that I almost felt sorry for them. I am like a pickpocket who steals nothing. That is how I thought of myself, and there were even times when I grew disgusted with my own nature. You will no doubt find it strange. How, being such a man, did I still have room to come to like the young lady of that house? How did I have room to take pleasure in gazing at her clumsy flower arrangements? How did I have room to listen gladly to the equally clumsy sound of her koto? If you ask me that, I can only say that both things were facts, and because they were facts, I can do nothing but tell them to you as facts. As for the interpretation, I leave that to you, who possess a mind. I will only add one thing. I came to doubt mankind where money was concerned, but where love was concerned, I had not yet come to doubt mankind. Therefore, however strange it may seem to others, or however contradictory it may seem, even when I think of it myself, both things existed together peacefully enough. Since I always called the widow Oku-san, I shall no longer call her the widow, but Oku-san from here on. Oku-san described me as a quiet man, a gentle man. She also praised me, saying that I was studious. Yet of my uneasy eyes and my restless darting manner, she said nothing at all. Whether she did not notice it, or whether she held back out of reserve, I cannot clearly tell. At any rate, it seemed as though she paid no attention to it whatever. More than that, on one occasion, she spoke of me as a generous-natured person, using a tone of voice that seemed almost respectful. At that time, honest as I was, I flushed a little and denied what she had said. Then Oku-san explained, "In all seriousness, you say so only because you do not notice it yourself. It seems that, at first, Oku-san had not intended to take in a student like me at all. Apparently, she had meant to rent the room to some man employed at a government office or something of that kind, and had asked someone nearby to help arrange it. Perhaps the thought had already entered some corner of her mind that a person whose salary was not abundant and who had no choice but to lodge in a private house would naturally be a certain kind of man. Oku-san compared me with that imagined lodger she had pictured in her heart, and praised me by saying that I was the more generous one. Certainly, compared with a person who had to live in such pinched circumstances, I may indeed have seemed generous in money matters, but that was not a question of temperament. So, for my inner life, it was almost the same as having no relation to me at all. Yet Oku-san, being a woman, tried to extend that judgment over my whole self and to apply the same word everywhere. Chapter 13. Oku-san's attitude naturally began to affect my state of mind. Before long, my eyes no longer darted about as they had before. I even began to feel as though my heart itself had truly settled in the place where I sat. In the end, it was perhaps because Oku-san and the others in the house, from the very beginning, paid no attention at all to my suspicious eyes and my distrustful manner, that they gave me so great a happiness. My nerves, receiving no reflection back from the other side, gradually grew calm. Since Oku-san was a woman of understanding, it may be that she deliberately treated me in just that way, or perhaps, as she herself openly said, she had really observed me and judged me to be broad and easy in nature. My restlessness may have been only a phenomenon inside my head, and may not have shown itself so much outwardly. If that was so, then perhaps Oku-san herself had simply been deceived by appearances. As my heart grew calm, I gradually became closer to the people of the household. I came to exchange jokes with Oku-san and with the young lady as well. There were days when I was called to the room on the other side because tea had been prepared. There were also evenings when I bought sweets myself and invited the two of them into my room. I felt as though all at once the range of my human relations had widened. Because of that, there were many times when the hours that should have been devoted to my important studies were used up instead. Yet, strangely enough, that interruption did not trouble me in the least. Oku-san, of course, was a woman with time on her hands. The young lady went to school, and on top of that, studied flower arrangement and the koto, so I assumed she must surely be busy. But that too, unexpectedly, was not the case. She always seemed to have all the time in the world, And so, whenever the three of us happened to see one another, we would gather together and pass the time talking about ordinary things. The one who came to call me most often was generally the young lady. Sometimes she would come round the veranda at a right angle and stand before my room. At other times, she would pass through the tea room and show herself from behind the sliding door of the next room. She would come there and stop for a moment. Then, without fail, she would call my name and ask, "Are you studying?" Most of the time, I was sitting at my desk with some difficult book spread open before me, staring down at it. To anyone at my side, I must indeed have looked like a diligent student, but in truth, I was not studying books with such earnestness as all that. My eyes rested on the page, yet all the while I was merely waiting for the young lady to come and call me. If I waited and she did not come, then there was nothing for it but for me, myself, to rise. And so I would go to the room across the way and ask from my side, "Are you studying?" The young lady's room was a 6-mat room adjoining the tea room. Sometimes Oku-san was in the tea room, and sometimes she was in her daughter's room. That is to say, though the two rooms were divided, it was almost the same as if they were not. The mother and daughter went back and forth between them, occupying both without clearly belonging to either one. When I called from outside, the one who answered, "Please come in," was always Oku-san. Even when the young lady was there, she hardly ever replied herself. Now and then, there also began to be occasions when the young lady, having come alone to my room, for some reason, would remain there, sit down, and fall into conversation. At such times, my heart would be seized by a strange uneasiness, and I could not think that the uneasiness came only from sitting face to face with a young woman. I would begin to feel restless and unsettled. It was the unnatural attitude by which I seemed to betray myself to myself that tormented me. Yet the other party, by contrast, was perfectly at ease. She was so little embarrassed that one might well have doubted whether this could truly be the same girl who could scarcely raise her voice properly when she practiced the koto. Sometimes, even when it went on so long that her mother called her from the tea room, she would answer only yes, and would not easily rise from where she sat. And yet, the young lady was by no means a child. My eyes understood that well. There were even clear signs that she conducted herself in such a way as to make it understood. Chapter 14. After the young lady left, I would draw a breath of relief, and at the same time I would feel both unsatisfied and somehow remorseful. Perhaps I was womanish. To you young people of today, I may seem even more so, but most of us in those days were much like that. Oku-san rarely went out. Even when she did occasionally leave the house, she never did so in a way that left the young lady and me alone together. Whether that too was accidental or deliberate, I could not tell. It is strange for me to say it myself, but when I watched Oku-san's manner closely, she somehow seemed to want to bring her daughter and me nearer to one another. And yet, in certain cases, she also seemed to be quietly on guard against me. Since I was encountering such a situation for the first time, it often made me feel deeply uncomfortable. I wanted Oku-san's attitude settled one way or the other. From the standpoint of reason, it could only be a plain contradiction. But the memory of having been deceived by my uncle was still fresh in me, and I could not help inserting one step further of suspicion. I supposed that in this attitude of Oku-san's, one side must be true and the other false, and I could not decide which was which. Not only could I not decide, I could not even understand what possible meaning there was in acting in so strange a way. When I tried to think out a reason and could not, there were times when I endured it by smearing the blame over that single word, woman. In the end, it is only because she is a woman, I told myself. Women, after all, are foolish creatures. Whenever my thinking came to a dead end, it always fell here. Yet even though I looked down on women so much, I could never, no matter what, look down on the young lady. My reasoning would not move at all in her presence. It was as though it had become wholly useless before her. Toward her, I felt a love almost akin to faith. You may find it strange to see me apply to a young woman a word I use only for religion, but even now, I believe it firmly. I firmly believe that true love is not so different from the religious spirit. Each time I saw the young lady's face, I felt as though I myself were becoming beautiful. Whenever I thought of her, it seemed to me that a noble feeling at once passed into me. If that mysterious thing called love has two ends, and if at its higher end there works a sacred feeling, while at its lower end there moves sexual desire, then my love had certainly seized that higher extreme. Of course, as a human being, I had a body that could not part from flesh, and yet the eyes with which I looked at her and the heart with which I thought of her carried no odor of the flesh at all. As I grew resentful toward the mother, and at the same time deepened in love toward the daughter, the relation among the three of us gradually became more complicated than it had been when I first came to board there. Even so, that change was almost entirely inward and scarcely showed itself outwardly at all. Before long, through a certain accidental occasion, I began to feel that perhaps I had misunderstood Oku-san all this time. I began to think again that neither side of her contradictory attitude toward me was false. And more than that, I came to think that the two did not alternately rule Oku-san's heart, but that both were always present in her breast at the same time. That is to say, although it seemed like a contradiction that Oku-san should try as much as possible to bring her daughter closer to me and at the same time be on guard against me, I came to see that when she exercised that caution, it was not that she forgot her other attitude, nor that she reversed it. Even then, she still continued, just as before, to wish to bring the two of us together. I interpreted it to mean only this, that she disliked the thought of the two of us drawing closer beyond what she herself recognized as proper, because not even the first sprout of a desire to approach the young lady from the side of the flesh had arisen in me. I thought then that hers was an unnecessary fear. But from that time on, I no longer felt inclined to think ill of Oku-san. Chapter 15. When I gathered together the various signs in Oku-san's manner, I became certain that I was fully trusted in this house. More than that, I even discovered evidence that this trust had existed from our very first meeting. To a heart like mine, which had begun to suspect others, this discovery struck with almost, I thought that, compared with men, women must possess that much more intuition. At the same time, I thought that perhaps it is for this very reason that women are deceived for the sake of men. When I think of it now, it is almost absurd that I, who observed Oku-san in that way, was at the same time letting the same kind of intuition work so strongly toward the young lady. For though I had sworn in my heart never again to trust others, I trusted the young lady absolutely, and yet I found it strange that Oku-san trusted me. I did not speak very much about matters in my native place. Above all, I said nothing about this recent affair. Even to let it rise in my mind already gave me a certain discomfort. So I tried, as much as possible, to hear only Oku-san's side of things, but she would not allow that. At every turn, she wanted to know the circumstances of my home in the country. In the end, I told her everything when I said that I would never return to my native place again, that even if I returned, there was nothing there for me except only the graves of my father and mother. Oku-san showed every sign of being deeply moved. The young lady wept. I thought I had done well to tell them. I was glad. After hearing all about me, Oku-san put on an expression that almost seemed to say, without saying it outright, that her intuition had indeed proved correct, and from then on, she treated me as though I were some young relative of her own. I did not resent it. Indeed, I might almost say that I found it pleasant. And yet, before long, my suspicious nature began to rise again. What first made me begin to suspect Oku-san again was something very slight. But when small things are added one upon another, suspicion gradually sends out roots. For some reason or other, it suddenly came into my mind that perhaps Oku-san, in the same sense as my uncle, was trying to bring the young lady close to me. Then, the woman who until now had seemed kind, all at once appeared before my eyes as a cunning schemer. I bit my bitter lips. From the beginning, Oku-san had openly said that, because the house was lonely and empty, she kept a lodger and looked after him. I never thought that was a lie. Even after we grew close, and I heard from her many intimate confidences, it still seemed to me that there was no falsehood in that. Yet their general financial condition was by no means what one would call abundant, and, when considered from the standpoint of advantage, forming some special tie with me, would by no means have been a loss to their side. So I raised my guard again. But what could come of it when I, who loved the daughter with the very strength I have already told you of, set myself on guard against her mother. I laughed at myself alone. There were even times when I cursed myself, saying, "What a fool!" But if that contradiction had been the only one, then however foolish I might be, I could still have borne it without great pain. My torment first truly began only when I was struck by the question of whether the young lady too, like Okusan, might be a schemer. When I thought that the two of them must be arranging everything after consulting together, behind my back I was suddenly seized with a suffering awe. I could hardly endure. It was not mere displeasure. It was a feeling of being driven into a complete dead end, as if there were no escape at all. And yet, on the other hand, I still believed in the young lady firmly and without doubt. Thus I stood between belief and bewilderment, unable to move in the least. To me, both were imagination, and yet both were truth. Chapter 16. I continued as before to attend school. Yet the lectures of the men standing at the lectern seemed to reach me as though from far away. My studies were the same. The printed characters that entered my eyes vanished like smoke before they could sink to the bottom of my heart. On top of that, I grew silent. 2 or 3 friends misunderstood this and told others that I seemed to be absorbed in meditation. I made no effort to correct their misunderstanding. Rather, I was glad of it, as though someone had kindly lent me a convenient mask. Even so, there must have been times when I could not bear it, for now and then I would suddenly grow wild and boisterous, to the astonishment of them all. My lodging was a house with few visitors. It seemed, too, that they had not many relatives. Now and then, a school friend of the young lady would come to visit, but it was the usual thing for them to speak in such very small voices that one could hardly tell whether anyone was there at all, and then go home. Even I did not realize that this reserve was shown out of consideration for me. Those who came to visit me were by no means great, rough fellows, yet there was not one among them so restrained as to feel awkward before the people of the house. In such matters, I, the lodger, was like the master of the house, while the young lady herself, who ought to have been the important one, stood almost in the position of a dependent. But I write this only because it came back to my mind. In truth, it is a point that hardly matters. There was only one thing there, however, that was not without importance. From the tea room, or else from the young lady's room, a man's voice would suddenly be heard, and unlike the voices of my own visitors, that voice would be extremely low. So low, indeed, that I could not understand at all what was being said. And the less I could understand, the more it gave a kind of agitation to my nerves. As I sat there, I would begin to feel strangely irritated. First I would wonder, is it some relative or merely an acquaintance? Then I would begin to ask myself whether it was a young man or someone older. Sitting where I was, There was no way such things could become known. Yet neither could I rise, go there, slide open the shoji, and look. My nerves did not so much tremble as beat in great waves and torment me. After the visitor had gone, I never failed to ask the man's name. The answers of the young lady or of Oku-san were always very simple, and though I showed them a dissatisfied face, I had not the courage to pursue the matter until I was satisfied. Of course, I had no right to do so. At one and the same time, I displayed before them the pride born of my upbringing that told me I must value my own dignity, and also the covetous, hungry look that was in fact betraying that very pride. They laughed, whether it was not mockery but came from kindness, or whether they only meant to make it look like kindness. I was so completely deprived of composure that I could not at once find room even for interpretation. And after it was over, I would go on repeating within myself again and again, I was made a fool of. Was I not made a fool of? I was a free man. Whether I left school halfway through or went anywhere and lived in any manner or married any person from any place, I stood in a position where I need consult no one at all. There had already been countless times when I resolved to make up my mind and speak to Oku-san about taking the young lady as my wife. And yet, every single time, I hesitated, and in the end, never brought it to my lips. It was not because I was afraid of being refused. If I were refused, I do not know how my fate might change. But in return, I would at least come to stand in a place different in direction from where I had stood before, and the convenience would arise of looking out upon a new world. So I could, if I chose, have summoned that much courage. But I hated the thought of being drawn in. More than anything, it enraged me to be made use of by another's hand. Having been deceived by my uncle, I had resolved that whatever might happen, from then on, I would never again be deceived by anyone. Chapter 17. Seeing that I did nothing but buy books, Oku-san told me I ought to have some clothes made. In truth, I owned nothing but cotton garments, woven in the country. Students in those days did not wear silk garments against their skin. Among my friends, there was one whose family, some Yokohama merchant's house, or something of the sort, lived in a rather showy style. Once, a habutai silk vest was delivered to him. When everyone saw it, they laughed. The man grew embarrassed and made all sorts of excuses, but instead of using the carefully sent vest, he threw it to the bottom of his trunk. Then all the others gathered round him and deliberately made him wear it. As luck would have it, lice got into the vest. My friend must have thought it a fine opportunity. He rolled up the now notorious vest, and while out on a walk, threw it into the great muddy ditch at Nezu. I was walking with him then, and stood on the bridge, laughing as I watched what he did. Yet nowhere in my heart did even the slightest feeling arise that it was a waste. Compared with those days, I too had become a good deal more grown, And yet, I still had not gained enough judgment to think of having proper clothes made for myself. I had the odd notion that until I graduated and the time came to grow a beard, there was no need to trouble myself about clothing. So I told Oku-san that books were necessary, but clothes were not. Oku-san knew how many books I bought. She asked whether I read them all. Among the things I bought were dictionaries, of course, but there were also some books which, though I certainly ought to have looked through them, had not even had their pages cut open. So I was hard put to answer her. Then it struck me that if one was going to buy things one did not really need anyway, it was all the same, whether they were books or clothes. Besides, under the pretext that I was already receiving so much care from them, I wanted to buy some sash or cloth that might please the young lady. So I entrusted everything to Oku-san. Oku-san would not say that she would go alone. She ordered me to come with her, and she said that the young lady, too, must come along. Raised as we had been in an atmosphere different from that of today, we had no habit as students of walking about much with young women. In those days, I was even more the slave of custom than I am now, so I hesitated somewhat, but at last I made up my mind and went. The young lady was dressed with great care. Her complexion was naturally fair, and because she had put on a generous amount of white powder, she stood out all the more. People in the street stared openly as they passed, and whenever they looked at the young lady, they would unfailingly turn their gaze and look at my face as well. It was a strange feeling. The three of us went to Nihonbashi and bought what we had meant to buy. Even in the very act of buying, their minds kept changing in one direction and then another, so it took much longer than expected. Oku-san would deliberately call me by name and ask, "What do you think?" Now and then she would drape a length of cloth vertically from the young lady's shoulder down across her breast and tell me to step back 2 or 3 paces and have a good look. Each time I would speak up as though I had every right to judge, saying, "That one won't do," or "That one suits her very well," or something of the sort. In this way, time passed, and by the time we returned, it was the hour for supper. As thanks to me, Oku-san said she would treat me to something good, and led me into a narrow side street where there was a Yosei theater called Kiharadana. The alley itself was narrow, and the eating place, too, was narrow. Since I knew nothing at all of the geography of that district, I was almost astonished at Oku-san's knowledge. We returned home after night had fallen. The next day was Sunday, so I remained shut up in my room the whole day through. When Monday came and I went to school, I was teased bright and early in the morning by one of my classmates. He asked me, with deliberate exaggeration, when I had taken a wife. Then he praised my wife, saying she was an extraordinarily beautiful woman. It seemed he had seen the three of us going out together to Nihonbashi, somewhere along the way. Chapter 18. When I returned home, I told Oku-san and the young lady about that incident." Oku-san laughed, yet she looked at my face and said that it must surely have been troublesome for me. At that moment, inside myself, I thought, so this is how a man is made to feel, that a woman has taken an interest in him. Oku-san's eyes held enough meaning to make me think so. At that time, perhaps I ought simply to have confessed directly what I myself was thinking. But by then, there was already stuck to me that murky lump called hesitation and doubt. I was just about to speak, and then suddenly stopped, and I deliberately shifted the angle of the conversation a little. I pulled out the essential matter, myself, from the middle of the question, and instead, I sounded out Oku-san's mind about the young lady's marriage. Oku-san plainly told me that there had indeed been one or two such talks, but she explained that, as the girl was still young enough to be attending school, they on their side were not especially in a hurry. Though Oku-san did not say it aloud, she seemed to place considerable weight on her daughter's looks. She even let slip something like this, that if they wished to decide the matter, they could do so at any time. And then, the fact that she had no child other than this daughter also seemed to be one reason why she was reluctant to let her go easily. There were even moments when I felt she might still be wavering between giving her in marriage or bringing in a husband. As we talked, I felt that I had gained various kinds of knowledge from Oku-san, and yet, because of that very thing, I fell into much the same result, as if I had missed my chance. About myself, in the end, I could not open my mouth and say a single word. At a suitable moment, I broke off the conversation and tried to return to my own room. The young lady who until just before then had been beside us, laughing and saying things like, "Oh, how terrible," had at some point moved away to a corner of the room, with her back turned toward us. As I was about to rise, I turned and saw that figure from behind. One cannot read a person's heart from a back alone. What the young lady thought about this matter, I had no way of knowing. She was sitting before a cupboard. From a gap where the cupboard door stood open about a foot, it seemed that she had drawn out something, placed it upon her knees, and was looking at it. My eyes found, at the edge of that opening, the cloth we had bought the day before yesterday. Both my kimono and the young lady's were laid together in a corner of the same cupboard. When I rose from my seat, without saying anything, Oku-san suddenly took on a more formal tone and asked me what I thought. The way she asked it was so abrupt that I almost had to ask in return, "What is it that you want to know what I think about?" When it became clear that she meant whether it would be wiser to settle the young lady's future as soon as possible, I answered that it would probably be better to go as slowly as possible. Oku-san said that she too thought so. Into the situation that existed between Oku-san, the young lady, and myself, there now had to come one more man. The result of that man's becoming a member of this household brought about an extraordinary change in my fate. If that man had not crossed the course of my life, then perhaps there would never have arisen any need for me to leave behind, for you, such a long letter as this. It was as though, helplessly, I had stood before the passing of a demon, and without noticing it, had my entire life darkened by the shadow of that instant. To confess the truth, it was I myself who dragged that man into the house. Naturally, Oku-san's permission was necessary, so at first I concealed nothing, told her everything openly, and asked her, but Oku-san said no, though on my side there were fully sufficient reasons why I had to bring him there. On Oku-san's side, for saying no, there was not a shred of sound logic at all. And so I forced through what I believed to be the right course. Chapter 19. I shall refer to this friend here by the name of K. K and I had been close since childhood, and when I say since childhood, you will understand without my saying it, that there was a tie of the same native place between us. K was the son of a Shinshu priest. He was not, however, the eldest son, but the second, and so he was given in adoption to the household of a physician. The region where I was born was one in which the power of the Honganji sect was very strong. So, compared with others, Shinshu priests seemed to be materially rather well favored. To give one example, if a priest had a daughter and that daughter came of age, the parishioners would consult among themselves and marry her off to some suitable place. Of course, the expense did not come from the priest's own pocket. For that reason, Shinshu temples were for the most part well off. The house where Kei was born also lived in reasonable comfort. But whether they had enough means to send a second son to Tokyo for study, I do not know. Nor do I know whether the adoption arrangement was settled because, through it, there would be a way for him to go out and study. That, too, is unknown to me. At any rate, Kay was adopted into a doctor's house. That was while we were still in middle school. I still remember now how surprised I was when the teacher, calling the roll in class, suddenly called Kay by a different family name. Kay's adoptive family, too, was quite wealthy. It was from them that Kay received his school funds and came to Tokyo. He did not come out at exactly the same time as I did, but once he arrived in Tokyo, he immediately entered the same boarding house as I had. In those days, it was common enough for 2 or 3 people to line up their desks and sleep and live in the same room. Kay and I too shared one room together. Perhaps we were like animals captured alive in the mountains, clinging to one another inside a cage while glaring out at the world beyond. The two of us feared Tokyo and feared the people of Tokyo, and yet, inside that 6-mat room, we spoke as though we were looking down upon all under heaven. But we were earnest. We truly meant to become great men. Kay, in particular, was strong. Born in a temple, he was forever using the word shojin, spiritual discipline, single-minded striving, and all his conduct and all his movements seemed to me to be describable by that one word alone. In my heart, I always stood in awe of Kay, even while we were still in middle school. Kay troubled me with difficult questions. about religion and philosophy. Whether this came from the influence of his father or from the atmosphere belonging to the house in which he was born, that is, to the temple, that special kind of building, I cannot tell. At any rate, he seemed to possess a character far more priest-like than that of ordinary priests. Originally, Kei's adoptive family had sent him to Tokyo, meaning to make him a doctor. Yet stubborn as he was, he had come to Tokyo already determined that he would not become one. I pressed him, asking whether that was not the same thing as deceiving his adoptive father and mother. Boldly, he answered that it was. He said that, for the sake of the way, such a thing did not matter. At that time, the word way, which he used, was probably not even well understood by Kei himself. And of course, I cannot say that I understood it either. Yet to us, being young as we were, that vague word rang nobly. Even if we did not understand it, still, under the rule of an exalted feeling, there could be nothing base in the spirit that sought to move in that direction. I agreed with Kei's argument. How much force my agreement had for Kei, that I do not know. Single-minded as he was, it is easy to suppose that no matter how strongly I might have opposed him, he would still have carried through exactly what he intended. And yet, even as a boy, I believed I understood well that in such a case, if I gave him the cheering voice of agreement, some measure of responsibility would naturally come to rest on me. Even if, at that time, I did not have so much readiness of mind, still, if the time should come when I must look back upon the past with adult eyes, I agreed with him in such a tone that it would be only proper for me to bear, on my own side, whatever portion of responsibility fell to my share. Chapter 20. Kei and I entered the same department. With a composed face and with money sent from his adoptive family, Kei set out along the road he himself desired. There is no other way to see it than that both feelings were in his heart at once. The reassurance that they would never find out, and the boldness that even if they did, he did not care. Kei was calmer than I was. In the first summer vacation, Kei did not return home. He said he was going to rent a room in a temple at Komagome and study there. I came back in early September, and true enough, he had shut himself away inside a shabby temple near the great cannon. His room was a narrow chamber just beside the main hall, but he seemed pleased that there, at last, he could study exactly as he wished. At that time, I think I recognized that his way of living was gradually becoming more and more priest-like. He wore a rosary around his wrist. When I asked what it was for, he showed me, with his thumb, the motion of counting one bead, then another. It seemed that he counted the circle of beads many times a day, but what it meant, I did not know. If one counts one bead at a time, something made into a perfect circle, then, however far one goes, there is no end. In what kind of place and with what kind of feeling did Kei stop the fingers that moved from bead to bead? It is a trifling thought, yet I have often wondered it I also saw a Bible in his room. Until then, I remembered often hearing the names of Buddhist sutras from his lips, but as for Christianity, there had never once been an occasion when he questioned me about it or answered about it. So I was a little surprised. I could not help asking him why. Kay said there was no reason. He also said that if this was a book so many people revered, then naturally one ought to read it. And he added that if he had the chance, he intended to read the Quran as well. He seemed to take great interest in the words Muhammad and sword. In the second summer, he finally returned home after being urged to do so from the country. But it appears that even after returning, he said nothing at all about his course of study. And at home, too, they failed once again to notice it. You, having received a school education, will understand this well, but the world at large is astonishingly ignorant about student life and school regulations. Things that are nothing to us do not reach the outside world at all. We, on the other hand, because we breathe only the air within, are too apt to imagine that everything in school, great and small alike, must surely be known throughout the world. Perhaps Kay, in that respect, understood the world better than I did, for he came back again with the same composed face. Since I had left home at the same time as he, the moment we boarded the train, I asked him at once how it had gone. Kay answered that it had made no difference. The third summer was the very year when I resolved to leave forever the place where my father and mother were buried. At that time, I urged Kay to return home, but he would not agree. What was the use, he said, of going home every year only to do nothing? He seemed determined to stay where he was and continue his studies. So in the end, I had no choice but to leave Tokyo alone. I will not repeat here how full of upheaval those 2 months I spent in my native place were for my fate, for I have already written it before. Carrying in a single breast resentment, melancholy, and the loneliness of isolation, I saw Kay again when September came, and then I found that his fate too, like mine, had taken a dark turn. Without my knowing it, he had sent a letter to his adoptive family, and from this side had confessed his deception himself. He said that he had been prepared for that from the very beginning. Perhaps he had even hoped to make them say, since things had come to this, there was no other course left but to let him do what he wished. At any rate, it seems he had no intention of deceiving his adoptive father and mother, even after entering the university. Or perhaps he had seen clearly that even if he tried to go on deceiving them, it could not continue for very long. Chapter 21. When Kay's adoptive father saw the letter, he was greatly enraged. He immediately sent back a severe reply, saying that he could not continue to send school funds to one so outrageous as to deceive his parents. Kay showed it to me, and almost at the same time, he also showed me a letter he had received from his birth family. It too contained words of stern rebuke, hardly less severe than the first, perhaps because there was added to it the obligation of making amends. To the adoptive family, they wrote there as well that they too would have nothing more to do with him. Whether because of this affair, K would be restored to his original family register, or whether some other compromise would be arranged so that he might remain as he was with the adoptive family, that was a problem still to come. But the immediate matter that had to be faced somehow was the monthly money necessary for his studies. I asked Kay whether he had any plan about that. He answered that he intended to become a teacher at a night school or something of the sort. Compared with the present, the world in those days was surprisingly less pressed, so opportunities for side work were not as scarce as you might imagine. I thought that, with such work, Kay would probably manage well enough. And yet, I had my own responsibility. When Kay chose to go along the path he himself wished against the hopes of his adoptive family, it was I who had approved him. Even so, I could not simply sit by with folded hands. So then and there, I at once offered him material assistance, but Kay rejected it without a second thought. From his character, it was natural that he should find it far more agreeable to support himself than to stand under the protection of a friend. He said that, having entered the university, if he could not somehow manage even himself alone, then he was no man. In order to fulfill my responsibility, I could not bear to wound Kay's feelings. So I let him do as he wished, and I drew back. Before long, Kay found the kind of work he had wanted. But for a man like him, who begrudged every hour, there was no need even to imagine how painful this labor must have been. Without slackening his studies in the least, he took on this new burden and drove himself forward. I worried about his health, but stout-hearted as he was, he only laughed and paid no attention whatever to my concern. At the same time, the relation between him and his adoptive family grew more and more entangled. Now that he had no margin of time, he lost the opportunities he had once had to talk with me as before. So in the end, I never heard the whole course of the matter in detail. But I did know this much, that the resolution of it was becoming more and more difficult. I also knew that someone had stepped in between them and tried to mediate. That person wrote to Kay, urging him to return home, but Kay replied that it was utterly impossible and would not yield. That stubbornness of his, Kay said merely that he could not return during the school term, and that there was nothing for it. But seen from the other side, it must have appeared nothing but stubbornness, and that too seemed to make the situation still more bitter. By injuring the feelings of his adoptive family, he also came to incur the anger of his birth family. When I, in my anxiety, wrote letters to both sides to try to reconcile them, it had already become useless. My letters were buried away without drawing even a single word of reply. I, too, became angry. Until then, from the course of events, I had sympathized with Kay. But after that, I came to feel that even setting aside all questions of right and wrong, I would still take Kay's side. At last, Kay finally resolved to be restored to his original register, the school money that had been spent on him by his adoptive family. In return, his birth family also said that since they too would no longer concern themselves, he was free henceforth to do as he pleased. In old terms, one might perhaps call it disowning him, or perhaps it was not quite so severe as that. Yet Kay himself understood it in that way. Kay was a man without a mother. One side of his character may surely be seen as the result of having been raised by a stepmother. I often think that if his real mother had still been alive, then perhaps the relation between Kay and his family might not have become so utterly estranged. His father, needless to say, was a priest, and yet, in the strictness of his sense of duty, one cannot help wondering whether he was not rather more like a samurai. Chapter 22. After Kay's affair had reached a temporary settlement, I received a long letter from the husband of his elder sister. The family into which Kay had been adopted was related to this man, and Kay had told me that when he was first placed there, and again when he was restored to his original family register, this man's opinion had carried considerable weight. The letter asked me to let him know how Kay had been faring since then. It added a request as well, saying that his sister was deeply worried and that they wished to receive a reply as soon as possible. Kay cared more for this sister, who had married into another house, than for the elder brother who had inherited the temple. All of them, of course, were brother and sister born of the same mother, but between this sister and Kay, there was quite a difference in age. So when Kay was a child, this sister, more than his stepmother, must have seemed to him like his true mother. I showed the letter to Kay. He said nothing, but he confessed that his sister herself had already sent him 2 or 3 letters of much the same meaning. Kay had replied each time he said that there was no cause for anxiety. Unfortunately, this sister had married into a household without much to spare, so however much she may have sympathized with Kay, there was no way she could materially help her younger brother. I wrote back to Kay's brother-in-law in much the same spirit as Kay. In that letter, I expressed in strong words that if the worst came to the worst, I would somehow see to everything, so they should set their minds at ease. This, of course, was entirely my own decision. Naturally, there was kindness in it, a desire to give reassurance to the sister who was worried about what would become of Kay. But there was also a trace of stubborn pride in me, directed toward Kay's birth family and his adoptive family, whose conduct toward me could be taken only as contempt. Kay was restored to his original register during his first year. From then until about the middle of his second year, for roughly a year and a half, he supported himself by his own strength alone. But this excessive labor gradually began to show its effects upon both his health and his spirit. No doubt, the constant turmoil of the question of leaving or not leaving his adoptive family was also helping to wear him down. He became more and more sentimental. At times, he would say things as though he alone were standing in the world, bearing all its unhappiness upon himself. And if I contradicted him, he would flare up at once. Then, too, it seemed to him that the light lying across his future was slowly receding farther and farther from his eyes, and that made him restless. When one first begins study, it is natural for everyone to set out on the new journey with great ambitions. But once a year passes, then two, and graduation begins to draw near, it is only natural for most men to realize suddenly how slow their own steps have been, and thereupon to fall into disappointment. In that sense, Kay's case was no different. Yet, compared with ordinary men, the violence of his impatience was far greater. At last, I came to think that the one thing above all was to calm his mind. I told him he must stop taking on extra work, and I advised him that for the present it would be wiser, for the sake of a greater future, to ease his body and spend some time at rest. Since Kay was so stubborn, I had long expected that he would never readily listen to anything I said. Yet, when I actually tried, I found it more difficult than I had imagined to persuade him, and it nearly wore me out. Kay insisted only that scholarship was not his true goal. His true aim, he said, was to cultivate the power of will and become a strong man. And from that, he concluded that he must remain as much as possible in narrow and trying circumstances. To an ordinary person, it would sound like sheer perversity. And more than that, although he was living in trying circumstances, his will was not growing the least bit stronger. Indeed, he was almost becoming a victim of nervous exhaustion. Since there was no help for it, I began to show him an attitude as though I entirely agreed. At last, I even declared plainly that I too meant to go forward through life in just such a way. To be sure, these were not words wholly empty for me, for when one listened to Kay, he had such force that one was gradually drawn in that direction as well. At last, I proposed that Kay and I should live together and together follow the road of self-improvement. I even dared to kneel before him, so intent was I on bending his stubborn will, and in the end, after much struggle, I finally brought him to live in my house. Chapter 23. My room had attached to it a 4-mat chamber, something like an anteroom. To go up from the entrance and reach the place where I stayed, one absolutely had to pass through that 4-mat room. So, from the practical point of view, it was an extremely inconvenient space. It was there that I put Kay. At first, to be sure, I had thought to place 2 desks in the same 8-mat room and let us share the adjoining chamber. But Kay said that even if it was cramped, he preferred being alone, and he chose that room for himself. As I have said before, Oku-san was at first opposed to this arrangement of mine. If this had been a boarding house, then 1 lodger would be convenient, 2 more convenient still, and 3 more profitable. But since this was not a business, she said it would be better, if possible, not to do such a thing. When I answered that Kay was certainly not the sort of man who would cause trouble, she replied that even if he caused no trouble, she disliked having a person whose character she did not know. When I pressed her, asking whether the same had not also been true of me, who was now lodging there, she would not stop insisting that my character had been clear to her from the very beginning. I smiled bitterly. Then Oku-san changed the direction of her reasoning again. She said once more that bringing such a man there would be bad for me and that I should stop. When I asked why it would be bad for me this time, she smiled bitterly instead. The truth is, I myself had no absolute need to live with Kay. Yet I thought that if I laid out before him, in the form of money, the monthly cost of living, he would surely hesitate when the time came to accept it. He was a man with that much independence of spirit. So I meant to bring him into my house, and then, without his knowing it, quietly place into Oku-san's hands enough for 2 men's food. But I had no intention whatever of telling Oku-san a single word about Kei's financial situation. I spoke only about Kei's health. I said that if he were left alone, he would only grow more and more obstinate and twisted. And then I added to that, telling her of Kei's poor relations with his adoptive family, of how he had become separated from his birth family, and of many other things besides. I told her that I meant to take Kei in with the resolve of embracing a man who was close to drowning, and of passing into him the warmth of my own body. With that in mind, I asked both Oku-san and the young lady to care for him kindly and warmly. Only after coming this far did I finally manage to persuade Oku-san. Kei, however, hearing nothing of any of this from me, knew nothing whatever of how it had all come about. And I, on the contrary, felt satisfied by that. And when Kei came lumbering in and moved his things, I received him with a face that showed nothing. Oku-san and the young lady kindly helped to put away his luggage and arrange his things. Interpreting all of that as coming from their goodwill toward me, I was pleased in my heart, even though Kei, for his part, still wore his same heavy, sullen look. When I asked Kei how he liked his new lodging, he said only one thing: "It is not bad." From my point of view, it was far more than merely not bad. The place where he had been living until then was a north-facing, filthy room that smelled damp and foul. The food, too, was as poor as the room itself. After moving into my house, Kei had almost the look of a man transplanted from a dark valley to a lofty tree. That he showed no sign of thinking much of it came partly from his stubbornness, but partly also from his convictions. Raised on Buddhist teachings, he was apt to think that making much of comforts in food, clothing, and shelter was almost a kind. Having read too many lives of ancient eminent monks and holy men, he had a tendency at every turn to want to separate spirit from flesh. There may even have been times when he felt that by whipping the flesh, the radiance of the spirit would increase. I made it my policy not to oppose him any more than necessary. What I tried to do was to bring ice out into the sunlight and let it melt. I thought that once it had melted and turned into warm water, the time would surely come when he himself would awaken to himself. Chapter 24. As a result of being treated in that way by Oku-san, I gradually became more cheerful. Because I was conscious of that, I then tried to apply the same thing to Kei as well. I knew well, from having associated with him for so long, that Kei and I were considerably different in character. Yet just as my own nerves had lost some of their sharpness After entering this household, so too I thought that if K were placed here, his heart also might one day grow calm. K was a man of stronger determination than I. He probably studied twice as much as I did. On top of that, the quality of mind he had been born with was far superior to mine. Later, our fields of study differed, so I cannot speak with certainty. But while we were in the same class, whether in middle school or in higher school, K always ranked above me. I was constantly aware that in whatever I did, I could never equal K, and yet, when I forcibly drew K into my own house, I believed that I understood the principles of things better than he did. As I saw it, he did not seem to understand the difference between endurance and patience. I especially want to add this for your sake. So, listen carefully. Whether of body or of spirit, all our powers, under the stimuli of the outer world, may develop or may be destroyed. But in either case, it is of course necessary to strengthen those stimuli little by little. If one does not think carefully, there arises the danger that one may keep advancing in a terribly harmful direction, while neither oneself nor those around one notice it at all. If one listens to the explanation of doctors, there is nothing so lazy as the human stomach. If one eats nothing but gruel, then before one knows it, it loses the power to digest anything harder. That is why doctors say one should practice eating everything. But I do not think this means merely becoming accustomed. It must rather mean that as the stimuli are gradually increased, the resisting power of the nutritive functions gradually grows stronger. If instead the power of the stomach were to weaken little by little, one can easily understand what the result would be, just by imagining it. K was a greater man than I, and yet he had not noticed this point at all. It seems he believed only that if one became accustomed to hardship, then at last that hardship would become nothing at all. He appears to have believed firmly that if one repeated suffering again and again, then by the merit of repetition alone, one would someday arrive at the moment when that suffering ceased to matter. When I tried to persuade K, this was the point I wanted above all to make clear to him. But if I had spoken of it, he would surely have resisted. And I thought he would certainly have brought up examples of men from former times. If that happened, then I too would have had to state clearly the points in which those men and K differed. If K had been the sort of man to accept that, all would have been well. But by his nature, once an argument went that far, he did not easily turn back. He went farther still, and just as he advanced, with words he would begin to realize them in action. When he became like that, he was a terrible man. He was great. He advanced while destroying himself with his own hands. Seen from the result, his greatness amounted only to this, that he was great in the sense of shattering his own success. Even so, he was by no means ordinary. Knowing his temperament well, I was in the end unable to say anything. Besides, as I have already mentioned, it seemed to me that he was suffering to some extent from nervous exhaustion. Even if I had succeeded in persuading him, he was certain to become violently agitated. I was not afraid of quarreling with him. But when I looked back upon my own condition, in which I myself could not endure the feeling of solitude, it was more than I could bear to place my close friend in that same condition of loneliness, and to go a step further, to push him down into an even lonelier state, was more hateful still. So even after he moved into my house, for some time I refrained from offering him any criticism that sounded like criticism. I decided only to watch quietly the effect that his surroundings might have upon him. Chapter 25. I went behind the scenes and the young lady to speak with Kay as much as possible, for I believed that the life of silence through which he had passed until then was the very thing that had begun to weigh upon him. Just as unused iron rusts, it seemed to me that rust had formed upon his heart as well. Oku-san laughed, saying that he was a man with no way to get hold of, and the young lady, taking the trouble, would even give me examples and explain them in detail. If they asked him whether there was fire in the brazier, he would answer that there was not. And if they then said they would bring some, he would refuse, saying he did not need it. If they asked whether he was cold, he would say, "I am cold, but I do not need it," and after that would answer no more. I could not merely smile bitterly. I felt sorry for them, and so I had no choice but to patch things up somehow, with a few words then and there. To be sure, it was springtime, so there was no great need to warm oneself by the fire. Even so, I thought it was not unreasonable for them to say that he gave no handle by which one might approach him. So I made it my effort, as much as possible, to place myself in the center and try to establish some connection between the two women and Kay. Sometimes, when Kay and I were talking, I would call in the people of the house. At other times, when the people of the house and I happened to be together in one room, I would draw Kay out and bring him there in whatever way best suited the moment. I tried to bring them into contact. Of course, Kay did not much like this. At times, he would suddenly rise and leave the room. At other times, no matter how often I called him, he would not come out for a long while. He would say, "What pleasure could there be in such pointless chatter?" I only laughed, but in my heart I understood very well that because of this, Kay despised me. From one point of view, perhaps I truly deserved his contempt. It may well be said that the place where his eyes were fixed was far higher than mine. I do not deny that, but for the eyes alone to be high while all the rest does not balance with them is nothing but an easy form of deformity. Above all else, at this moment, I thought it was my first duty to make him more human. No matter how much his mind might be filled with images of great men, if he himself did not grow great, it would be of no use at all. This was what I had come to discover. And so, as the first means of making him more human, I devised a way to seat him first beside the opposite sex. Then, after exposing him to the atmosphere that arose from that, I tried to renew the blood in him which had begun to rust. This attempt gradually succeeded. What had at first seemed unlikely to blend began little by little to come together into one whole. It seemed that Kay, bit by bit, was awakening to the fact that there was a world outside himself. One day he said to me something to the effect that women were not things to be despised so lightly. At first, it seems that Kay had been demanding from women, just as from me, knowledge and learning, and when he failed to find them there, he immediately gave way to contempt. Until then, he had not known that one must change one's standpoint according to sex, but had observed all men and women alike with the same gaze. I said to him that if we two alone, as men, were to go on exchanging words forever, then the two of us would do no more than extend straight ahead in a single line. He answered that it was true. At that time, I was already more or less carried away over the young lady, so perhaps that is why such words came naturally to my lips. But of the hidden matter behind them, I did not reveal to him a single word. To watch Kay's heart, which until then had built itself a wall of books and shut itself up inside, gradually begin to open, that was for me more delightful than anything, since from the first I had set all this in motion for just that purpose. I could not help feeling the joy that came with my own success. Instead of telling Kay himself, I spoke of what I had intended to Oku-san and to the young lady. Both of them, too, seemed pleased. Chapter 26. Kay and I were in the same department, but since the subjects we specialized in were different, there were naturally differences in the times when we went out and when we returned. If I came back earlier than he did, I merely passed through his empty room. If I came back later, it was my habit to exchange a brief greeting and then enter my own room. Kay would lift his usual eyes from his book and glance once at me as I opened the sliding door. Then he would invariably ask whether I had just returned. Sometimes I would only nod without answering. At other times, I would merely say yes and pass on. One day, I had business in Kanda and came home much later than usual. I hurried up to the gate and slid open the lattice door. At that very moment, I heard the young lady's voice. I was certain the voice came from Kay's room. If one goes straight in from the entrance, the tea room and the young lady's room lie in a row, and if one turns left from there, then come Kay's room and my room. Since I had been living there for so long, I could tell very well where a voice came from and whose voice it was. I immediately shut the lattice again. At the same time, the young lady's voice also ceased at once. While I was taking off my shoes, from about that time, I had already become modern enough to wear elaborate lace-up shoes. While I crouched there, undoing the laces, not a single voice came from Kay's room. I found it strange. I thought that perhaps I had simply been mistaken. Yet when, as usual, I went to pass through Kay's room and opened the sliding door, the two of them were indeed sitting there together. Kay, as always, said So, you have just come back? The young lady, too, without rising, greeted me by saying, "You're home?" It may have been only my imagination, but that simple greeting sounded slightly stiff to me. It struck my ear as though somewhere it had missed the natural tone. I asked the young lady where Oku-san was. There was no special meaning in my question. The house had somehow seemed quieter than usual, that was all, and so I asked. Oku-san was in fact out. The maid, too, had gone out with her. So, the only ones left in the house had been Kay and the young lady. I tilted my head a little. For all the long time I had been cared for there had never yet been an instance in which Oku-san left the house empty, leaving only the young lady and me behind. I asked the young lady again whether some urgent matter had arisen. The young lady only laughed. I disliked women who laughed at such a moment. If one says that this is merely a common trait in young women, perhaps that is all. But the young lady, too, was one who liked to laugh at foolish little things. However, seeing my expression, she immediately returned to her ordinary look. "It is not anything urgent," she answered seriously. "There was only a little errand." So she went out. As a lodger, I had no right to press the question further. So I fell silent. Before I had even changed my clothes and properly taken my seat, Oku-san and the maid had both come home. Soon the time came when we all sat face to face at the supper table. When I had first come to lodge there, I was treated entirely as a guest, and each time we ate, the maid brought my tray to me. But before I knew it, that custom had disappeared, and it had become the habit for me to be called into the other room at mealtime. When Kay newly moved in, I insisted that he too be treated in the same way as I was. In return, I presented Oku-san with a light dining table made of thin boards, its legs neatly folding in. Nowadays, it is the sort of thing used in every house, but in those days, there were almost no families who lined up around such a table to eat their meals. I had gone expressly to a furniture shop in Okonomizu and had it made according to my own design. It was there, at that table, that I heard from Oku-san the explanation that the fishmonger had not come at the usual time that day, so she had had no choice but to go into town to buy something for us to eat. When I thought that, certainly, since she had lodgers in the house, that was only reasonable, the young lady looked at my face and burst out laughing again. But this time, Oku-san scolded her, and she stopped at once. Chapter 27. About a week later, I again passed through the room where Kay and the young lady were talking together. At that time, the instant the young lady saw my face, she burst out laughing. I ought, perhaps, to have asked at once what there was to laugh at. Instead, I simply kept silent and came on to my own room. And because of that, Kay too was no longer able, as he always did, to call out and ask whether I had just come home. The young lady seemed at once to slide open the shoji and go into the tea room. At supper, the young lady said that I was a strange person. Even then, I did not ask why I was strange. I only noticed that Oku-san turned upon her a look almost like a warning glare. After the meal, I took Kei out for a walk. The two of us went round by the back of Denzuen, circled along the road by the botanical garden, and then came out again at the foot of Tomizaka. As walks go, it was by no means a short one, and yet what we said during all that time was very little. By nature, Kei was a man even more taciturn than I, and I too was not one for many words. Still, as we walked, I tried as much as possible to start conversations with him. My questions were chiefly about the family in whose house we lodged. I wanted to know how he regarded Oku-san and the young lady, but he gave me nothing but answers, so vague that one could not tell whether they belonged to the sea or to the mountain. And though those answers lacked all substance, they were, at the same time, extremely brief. He seemed to be paying far more attention to the subject of his specialization than to the two women. To be sure, the examinations of our second year were then close at hand, so from the standpoint of an ordinary man, he was perhaps the more student-like student. And besides, he went on speaking of Swedenborg this way and that, and astonished me, who knew so little. When we both got through our examinations successfully, Oku-san was pleased and said that now there was only 1 year left, and the graduation of the young lady, who might almost be called Oku-san's only pride, was also coming soon in turn. Kei said to me that women leave school knowing nothing at all. He seemed not to count in the least the sewing, the koto, or the flower arrangement which the young lady was practicing outside her studies. I laughed at his carelessness, and once again, before him, I repeated that old argument that a woman's value does not lie in such things. He did not particularly argue back, but neither did he show any sign of saying, "Indeed, that is so." That pleased me, because his manner, as though saying only, seemed to show that he still despised women, because it seemed that the young lady, whom I knew as the very representative of women, counted for nothing at all in his eyes. Looking back now, I can see that my jealousy of Kei had already begun to sprout fully at that time. I asked Kei whether he would like to go somewhere during the summer vacation. Kei gave me to understand that he did not wish to go. Of course, he was not in a position to go wherever he liked by his own free will. Yet if only I invited him, he was still free enough to go anywhere without difficulty. I asked him why he did not wish to go. He said there was no reason at all. He said it simply suited him better to stay at home and read books. When I insisted that it would be better for his health to go to a summer place and study somewhere cool, he answered that in that case I should go alone. But I could not bring myself to leave Kei behind here by himself. Even as it was, to watch Kei and the people of the house gradually becoming closer was already not a very pleasant feeling to me. If one asks why the thing I had wished for from the beginning should now make me feel so bad, then that is the end of it. I must simply have been a fool. At last, unable to bear the endless argument between the two of us, Okusan stepped in between. And so, in the end, the two of us decided to go together to Boshu. Chapter 28. Kei was not a man who often went traveling. Boshu, too, was my first experience. Knowing nothing at all, the two of us landed at the first place where the boat arrived. I believe it was called Hota. How much it has changed by now, I do not know, but in those days, it was a dreadful fishing village. First of all, everywhere smelled of fish, and then, when one went into the sea, the waves would knock one down and at once skin the hands and feet. Stones as large as fists were forever being rolled back and forth. I soon grew sick of it, but Kay said neither that it was good nor that it was bad. At least his expression alone remained perfectly calm. And yet, every time he entered the sea, there was never an occasion when he did not come away with some sort of injury. At last, I persuaded him, and we left there for Tomiura. From Tomiura, we moved again to Nago. All along that coast, even in those days, the places were chiefly where students gathered, so anywhere there was for us a perfectly suitable place for sea bathing. Kay and I often sat upon the rocks along the shore and gazed out at the color of the distant sea, or down into the bottom of the nearer water. The water seen from atop the rocks was especially beautiful. Little fish, red, blue, and other colors not commonly seen in the market, could be clearly pointed out, swimming here and there through the transparent waves. I would often sit there and spread out a book. Kay, more often than not, did nothing but remain silent. I could not tell at all whether he was sunk in thought or entranced by the scenery, or painting in his mind some image of his own liking. From time to time, I would lift my eyes and ask Kay what he was doing. Kay would answer with a single phrase only, that he was doing nothing. There were many times when I thought how pleasant it would be if the one sitting motionless beside me there were not Kay, but the young lady. If it had only gone that far, it would still have been all right. But at times, I would suddenly begin to suspect that perhaps Kay, too, was sitting there on the rocks with the same wish as mine. Then, all at once, I would come to hate the sight of myself sitting there calmly with a book spread open. I would suddenly spring up, and then I would let out a great shout with no restraint at all. I was incapable of anything so mild as reciting with seeming pleasure some proper poem or song. I could only howl like a savage. Once, all at once, I seized him from behind by the collar. I asked Kay what he would do if I pushed him straight into the sea. Just like that, Kay did not move. Still facing away from me, he answered, "That would be just right. Do it." I at once released my hand from the back of his neck. By that time, Kay's nervous exhaustion seems already to have grown considerably better, and in inverse proportion, I myself was becoming more and more oversensitive. Seeing Kay more composed than I envied him. And I hated him as well, because no matter what, he showed not the slightest sign of taking me seriously. To me, that appeared like a certain kind of confidence, and yet, even when I admitted that confidence in him, I could never find satisfaction in it. My suspicion wanted to go one step farther and make clear its true nature. Had he once again recovered the feeling of the light that lay before him in the road, he must go forward on, whether in scholarship or in work. If it were only that, then no conflict of interest could possibly arise between Kay and me. On the contrary, I would only have felt glad that all my efforts in caring for him had not been in vain. But if his peace of mind concerned the young lady, then I could never forgive him. Strangely enough, he appeared to be entirely unaware of any sign that I loved the young lady. Of course, I myself had never behaved in any deliberate way that would make it obvious to Kay's eyes. Kay was, by nature, a dull man in matters of that kind. From the very beginning, I had felt secure that if it were Kay, there would be no danger, and it was because of that I had deliberately brought him into the house. Chapter 29. I resolved at last to confess my heart to Kay. To be sure, this resolution had not first arisen at that moment. Even before we set out on the journey, I had already formed that intention within myself. Yet I could neither seize the proper opportunity nor create it for myself. In such matters, my skill failed me. Looking back now, it seems to me that all the people around me in those days were in some way strange. There was not one who would speak openly and directly about women. No doubt among them there were many who had no such story to tell. Yet, even if they had, it seemed to be the rule to remain silent. From the standpoint of you who now breathe a relatively freer air, this will surely seem strange. Whether it was the lingering influence of moralism or a kind of bashfulness, I leave that judgment to your understanding. Kay and I were on terms where we could speak of anything. Now and then, questions of love or passion did come up between us, but they always fell away into abstract theory. Even those subjects were rarely discussed. For the most part, we were occupied with talk of books, of learning, of future work, of ambition, and of self-cultivation. However close two men may be, once things have hardened to such a degree, one cannot suddenly break the tone. The two merely grow closer while remaining hard. Since I first resolved to confess to Kay about the young lady, I do not know how many times I suffered from a gnawing impatience and distress. I felt that I wanted to break through some single place in Kay's mind and blow into it. A softer air, what must seem to you utterly laughable, was in truth, for me then, a most difficult trial. Even on that journey, just as when I was at home, I remained a coward. Though I watched Kay constantly, with the intention of seizing some opportunity, I could do nothing at all about his strangely exalted attitude. As I saw it, The whole region surrounding his heart might as well have been coated thick with black lacquer. The blood I wished to pour into him could not send a single drop into that heart, but was wholly repelled and thrown back. At times, his manner seemed so strong and so lofty that I even grew reassured. And then, repenting in my heart of my suspicions, I apologized to Kay within that same heart. While apologizing, I saw myself as an exceedingly base person, and suddenly felt a miserable disgust. Yet, after a little while, the old suspicion would return again and strike back more strongly than before. Since everything was derived from suspicion, everything turned to my disadvantage. Even in appearance, Kay seemed to me more likely than I to be liked by women. His nature, too, not fussy and cramped as mine was, seemed likely to please the opposite sex. There was in him something vague, almost absent-minded, and yet at the same time something sure and manly. Even in that, he appeared to stand above me. As for learning, though our specialties differed, I was of course aware that I was no match for Kay, and when all of the good points on his side began to glitter at once before my eyes like this, then the slight reassurance I had felt would immediately vanish, and I would fall back again into my old uneasiness. Kay, seeing how restless I was, said that if I disliked it so much, I might as well return to Tokyo for the time being. But when he said that, I suddenly no longer wanted to return. Perhaps, in truth, I simply did not want to let Kay return to Tokyo. The two of us went round the tip of Boshu and came out on the farther side. Under the blazing sun, we suffered terribly, trudging on, deceived again and again by those long Kazusa Rai, groaning as we walked. I scarcely understood at all what meaning there was in walking like that. Half in jest, I said as much to Kay. Kay answered that since we had feet, we walked, and when the heat grew fierce, he would say, "Let us go into the sea," and plunge into the water, wherever he pleased. Then, after that, the strong sun would beat down on us once more, and our bodies became so languid that they felt utterly worn out. Chapter 30. As we walked in this way, the body's natural balance began to give way under the heat and the fatigue. It was not illness exactly. Rather, it felt as though my soul had suddenly moved and taken up lodging inside another man's body. While speaking with Kay, as I always did, I somehow began, somewhere within, to separate from my usual state of mind. Both my affection for him and my hatred of him took on a special character, as though they belonged only to the journey. In other words, because of the heat, the sea, and the walking, the two of us must have entered into a new relation different from the one before. At that time, we were like two peddlers traveling the road together. No matter how much we talked, it was unlike our usual talk, and we never touched those difficult matters that require the use of the mind. In this fashion, we went all the way at last to Choshi. Yet even now, I cannot forget that there was, on the road, one single exception. Before we had yet left Bashu, the two of us went at Kominato to see the Tai no Ura. Many years have passed since then, and it was not something that interested me deeply, so I do not remember it clearly. But as I recall, they said it was the village where Nichiren had been born. There was a legend that on the day of Nichiren's birth, 2 sea bream were cast up upon the shore, and because of that, the fishermen of the village, from that time on to the present, had refrained from catching sea bream, so that the bay was full of them. We hired a little boat and deliberately went out to see those sea bream. At that time, I was intent only on watching the waves, and in those waves, the slightly purplish color of the moving sea bream held my eyes without tiring as one more curious spectacle. But Kay, it seems, could not take as much interest in it as I did. Rather than the fish, he appears to have been imagining Nichiren himself in his mind. There was just there a temple called Tanjoji. Since it was the village where Nichiren was born, they must have named it the Temple of Birth, or something of that sort. It was a splendid temple complex. Kay said that he wanted to go there and meet the head priest. To tell the truth, we were dressed in a very strange fashion. Kay in particular, because the wind had blown his hat into the sea, had bought a sedge hat and was wearing that. As for our clothes, both of ours were naturally grimy and had grown rank with sweat. I said we had better not go to meet any priest, but Kay was stubborn and would not listen. If I disliked it, he said, I could wait outside by myself. So I had no choice but to go with him to the entrance, though in my heart I was certain we would be refused. But priests, it turns out, can be surprisingly courteous. We were shown into a wide and splendid room, and were received at once. By that time, my way of thinking had grown rather different from Kay's, so I felt little urge to pay much attention to the conversation between the priest and Kay. But Kay seemed to be asking eagerly about Nichiren. I still remember that when the priest said that Nichiren was even called Grass Nichiren because he was so skillful in cursive writing, Kay, whose own handwriting was poor, made a face that seemed to say, "What nonsense! How trivial!" Kay must have wanted to know not such things as that, but a Nichiren of deeper meaning. Whether the priest satisfied Kay on that point is doubtful, but when we left the temple grounds, Kay began at once to speak to me again and again about Nichiren. I was too hot and too exhausted to care about such things, so I gave him only vague replies from the edge of my lips. Then even that grew trouble silent. I believe it was the following night, or perhaps the next, that after reaching our inn, eating our supper, and coming to the point just before bed, we suddenly began to argue over difficult questions. Kay had not been pleased that when he had spoken the day before about Nichiren, I had not really responded. He said that a man without spiritual aspiration was a fool, and began somehow to press me down as though I were a shallow and frivolous fellow. But in my own breast there still lay the matter of the young lady, heavy and unresolved. So I could not simply accept his words, which were close to contempt, with a laugh. And so, for my own part, I began to defend myself.